Welcome to Plymouth University, welcome to the Roland Levinsky building, and welcome to this evening's CogTalk, which is on the topic of architecture. All of us live in buildings of one kind or another, and we often take these buildings for granted, being unaware of how these buildings can shape what we do. And to talk about this rather interesting topic, the influence of architecture on behaviour, we have three speakers this evening. We have Dr. Sana Murrani from Plymouth University, who's a lecturer in architecture, and we've got Dr. Mathew Emmett from Plymouth University, who's also a lecturer in architecture, as well as being exhibitors throughout the country and throughout the world. And we have a very famous artist who's come all the way from London, thank you very much, Knowles, who's a practicing artist and is very interested in making visible that which is often unseen. So I'm going to start this evening by asking Sana if she wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about how people behave in the urban environment.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming and thanks for inviting me to the CogTalk. I'm a lecturer in architecture, but I'm also interested mainly... What's going on? Oh. Please wait while the system starts up. That's what it's saying.
Oh, yeah.
The first hiccup of the day.
Can
There,
you switch the
I'm
microphone on?
We can't hear you.
You can't hear me? No? Yeah. We'll do something with that.
Excuse me. There we go.
Feel free to... Yep, is that right?
Yeah.
Excellent. Right. Oh, and now I'm going to have to listen to myself. Right. Well, I'm interested in theories of space and place, but I'm going to talk a little bit about how architects use ideas from cognition, perception, and utilize them within their own work. So this is sort of the overall arching thing of my talk. So I see architecture as a cultural and societal product, and I will talk about that in sort of a bit more in context. I'm going to explore this through three main ideas, and I'm going to be sort of approaching each one of them as I go along. So I'm interested in leftover spaces, spaces that are abandoned between buildings, derelict buildings. So it's not necessarily just spaces, but also buildings that I'm interested in. And in general, the ones that are marginalized and they're sort of shunned from society. So quite few of those sites are restricted access and the likes of that. I'm also interested in looking at it from a social anthropology sort of perspective, because I'd like to see how people operate in around urban environments. So I follow Victor Turner, who's a British anthropologist who works on the ideas of liminality in space, and this is the idea of spaces which are transitional. They sort of keep changing and moving, so this is where the edge and periphery comes from. And he sees people operating within society through endless negotiations of actors or agencies, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in specific. And sort of an understanding of how they operate within space through their own sort of participation with each other. Just to give you a little bit of background, urban planning and urban design in particular, post-war architecture was very much of a top-down approach. Builders and urban planners did not give any sort of consideration to people's needs. And what that did is that they were marginalizing the people who were living in those spaces. But at the beginning of the 60s, so a sort of a surge of interests in architects, urban theorists, and designers who were very much interested in looking at how people operate in and around urban spaces so that they will design for them, so that designing for the people. And part of that was observational, so quite few of the work was basically literally taking a chair, going out in a square and observing how people go around their day-to-day life. And then it moved on to become something a bit more of a technologically sort of sophisticated, where they worked with ideas, social mapping, and space syntax is one of the really good examples of working with technologically sort of switched on mapping exercises to expose places in the city that are hidden or sort of seen. So we are very visually oriented kind of people, and half of the sensory information going to the brain is visual. This is what Nobel Prize winner Eric Kendall said. And what's interesting about this is that we are interested in facial recognition, but also pattern recognition. This is something that architects really got interested in, because the idea of us dealing with visual information, spatial information, day in and day out, is something of the norm in our practice. So we can definitely see that drunken octopus, and we can see those scary, horrid, look, this is exactly why I hate peppers. But in sort of the practice and what artists and architects tried to do with those sort of techniques or ideas from principles of visual perception is that they tried to create new worlds, challenges for people, and bringing in a new sort of explanations, or sort of teasing out what reality means, and maybe challenging that. Leandro Leak is an Argentinian artist. Don't worry, none of these people are hurt. They're not actually jumping off something. What he did is he found a plot in an empty plot, a derelict sort of site in London. And what he inverted the facade of a building on the ground, and he invited people to come and use it as a playground. And what he literally just put a canvasy type of reflective material, and it reflects what people are sort of interacting with that space. It's an interesting way, because installation pieces of art sort of work came about at the time where people were just about starting to get interested in exploring ideas of perception or cognition within architecture, but they couldn't do it on a fully fledged architectural piece. So installation pieces of work became quite a profound thing that they used. Making sense of space, making sense of meaning, and the rest of it is all driven through narratives, through ideas which are connected and networked socially, which is what I'm trying to sort of talk about in particular here. Me and Mathew Emmett, who's going to give a talk afterwards, worked on a project together which was part of Peninsular Art. The project was about challenging ideas of a projection of reality. So basically getting you to go through an installation piece which challenges the idea of existence, of you being able to see yourself in multiple forms. So the project was done with cooperation with the Plymouth City Council, who put in an ad for architects and artists, basically an interest, who can come and bring a new way of seeing the exhibits within the museum. And it was sort of challenging the traditional norms of what an exhibit within a museum looks like. So what we did was we borrowed 4 cabinets from the museum and we stuck them on plinths. And at this stage, we're not challenging anything. This is very sort of simple, sort of basic thing. And then we added a Mac within each one of those cabinets. They're facing each other, so you can see those in plan. This is the side. This is the side of it. And each one of them had a webcam as well. And what that did was, as you approach going through the installation, you will be picked up from one webcam and you will be thrown and projected in another part. So it started getting people interacting. It was, to begin with, it was something weird, seeing yourself projected somewhere else, but then started getting people interacting with each other, and it became a social sort of space of its own. And I suppose what we really tried to do is we tried to take the person who is just a viewer, normally in a traditional environment, in exhibitions in museums, and putting them right at the heart of that exhibit and getting them to become creators and participants in that. So just to sum up, I talked about the peripheries and edges, but really what I'm most interested in is the negotiations of actors or agencies, and Tim is going to be speaking about agencies a little bit more in space. I see space as relational and relative to one another, and I see it as a social space as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sana. That's very, very interesting, showing the relationship between ideas and space and architecture. And now I'm going to ask Tim if he would like to tell us a little bit about his practice as an artist, and how that practice as an artist relates to our understanding of space.
Can you all hear me all right if I talk without the mic?
I prefer not to. Okay. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Right. So I'm going to talk about a small number of, we haven't got much time, so a small number of pieces that I've done. These are works that I guess relate to the context of the walk-on exhibition, which is here at the moment. This is part of, I guess. And I've got a piece down at Plymouth College of Art in the gallery there as part of that exhibition. But they're also, so these are all works that involve walking, but they're also works that look at space and explore space in kind of various different ways, very often with the space itself, the landscape or the, whether that's urban or rural, directing the walk, if you like. I very much don't see myself as a walking artist. I make other works, but just tonight I'm showing walking works. I'm just going to set my timer so I know how long I've been. So this was a piece that I did, and I've been doing various works looking at the wind and utilising the wind, and I had the idea to make a walk where I was guided by the wind, just walking wherever the wind took me. I guess a kind of romantic sort of idea to see what happened. And so here I created this little mechanism. Very often I use systems, mechanisms, to use external forces to direct me. Most of the work is all generated by things beyond my control. That's a big factor, and always has an element of movement. So I created this little wind vane and a rest for my arm, supported by the backpack and a bullet camera, and set off on Dartmoor to make this walk wherever the wind took me. I ended up walking around in lots of circles. It's quite unsuccessful because the wind vane was in the lee or the shadow of my body. So it really didn't function particularly well. So I had to find a way to do this walk, but without myself sort of causing this feedback problem. And the logical thing to do was to stick it on my head. And so I created this apparatus, this mechanism. It's got a helmet with a stainless steel pivot joint, and then this carbon fibre and kind of kite technology structure. Bullet camera at the back and a counterweight as well. So the thing's perfectly balanced. So when I am standing here, if I came to the road or inside or outside, I can turn my head, and there's no way I can control or alter what this does, because the friction compared to the wind sort of resistance on the sail, it doesn't get resistance to that. And so I made these series of walks through the city, walking at night, so in the very early hours of sort of Monday, Tuesday nights, so that the city was quite free and I was able to move easily through it without, colliding with traffic and all those people that were there in the day. And it became this very funny act, this very strange act of kind of doing it in the night, and it being this act that's like dowsing, if you like, or a very automatic kind of sleepwalking, just following this thing and trying to stay in tune with every little movement of this wind vane. So just sticking as one with it. And a very interesting way of exploring a city that I know fairly well, and I set off, this is actually, there's a piece I'm going to show you, which is 7 Walks from 7 Dials, and I know that area pretty well, I thought, but I ended up being directed down all these little back alleys, finding these hidden gardens and all sorts of things like this that I never knew existed, just, literally, less than a block away from a regular commute on my bicycle. And so I would get blown down, and so what I did, I would follow this, and if it came to a wall, I would stop and face the wall. If it starts to move this way, I move along. If it moves back this way, I move along that way. Much like someone who's not very good at playing a video game, you kind of run along the wall, you get to the corner, and you shoot around. And I often end up down these end of alleys with sort of little cul-de-sacs with plastic bags and leaves. So, all of the walks were plotted out. And so this piece was 7 Walks from 7 Dials, and so I repeatedly went back to 7 Dials, which has 7 streets radiating out from it in London, and waited until the wind blew me down each of those 7 streets. I only made it a little way down the 7th one. I kept going back, the wind was very rarely going. And so what's interesting for me is the way that this meandering path, this very loose, chaotic kind of path, starts to collide with the structure of the city and starts to draw out certain elements of the city. So here, this is just that sort of the 2 parallel lines. There's only one there, but that's a row of cars, in fact. And obviously you start to see streets and blocks where I sort of start to draw out the corners. And here you have, this is actually offices, and the wind was repeatedly, pushing me against these offices, and I really liked the way that started to draw out that perimeter, that limit of that space. And there were security guards in here who I was constantly walking past their windows in the offices and could see me on their cameras going past their loading zones. But yeah, you've got ventilation shafts and other things starting to be revealed. So each one of these 7 lines, like some kind of child's spaghetti drawing, lead back to the centre. And also, there are other things, I won't go into too much detail, but the limits of certain spaces you're not allowed to go into. So in some areas I was stopped from entering spaces. So this is just, I'm talking about a few other artists' work really as well, just to kind of open it up. Very briefly, spent much time, but this is Vito Conci. It's called The Follow piece from 1969, where he just picked people and would follow them and film it. But I think as another way of exploring the city through someone else's life, quite interesting. I'll talk briefly about the night walks. This is the piece where I set up a camera on a tripod, looking out into the landscape, and then I walk away from the camera with these huge floodlight torches, really big torches. And it's done during a new moon, so there's no moonlight. And so I'm basically drawing in the landscape with light that's then recorded on the negative in one long exposure photograph. So there's a couple of others. This is actually an hour and 40 minutes. So I'm sort of 7 miles away by the time I end up there. But what I was interested about was the way that this, the other drawings plot my route from a vertical viewpoint, if you like, and we're very used to our paths being logged on maps and with GPS from a vertical point of view. But in this case, it's kind of from a horizontal point of view in the landscape, and I think there's something interesting about that. And of course, similarly to some of the other works, like the wind walks, I mean, here I'm walking a trail along a ridge, a path, and I know my route. I'm just following this path. I don't know the route till I do it. But I don't know how the photo's going to turn out. And it's not even until I get back to sort of London and process this picture that I find out how the photos have turned out. And they all are all just standard prints. There's no digital manipulation or anything like that. They're wet prints. Another artists were Christian Knowles. This was Emotion Maps, which is a piece that he got various people to wear these little sensors that detected your stress levels. And then he got them to do these walks, Greenwich Peninsula and various other places, and created these maps, these emotion maps. So it's the way that the city kind of affects people. And one of the things I was going to say earlier about the wind walks and some of the other work is the idea of the dream, and this moving through a city and allowing the city to subconsciously guide you. So that was a similar way the Situationists was doing that. And a similar way to some of my walks where the landscape guides you through a mechanism with my work. And I have to talk about this piece. I really like this piece, Douglas Hubler, and I'll read it out. So this is called Duration Piece number 5, and during a 10-minute period of time, on March 17th, 1969, 10 photographs were made, each documenting the location in Central Park where an individual, distinguishable bird call was heard. Each photograph was made with the camera pointing in the direction of the sound. That direction was then walked towards by the auditor until the instant that the next call was heard, at which time the next photograph was made and the next direction taken. And then it sort of says, the 10 photographs joined with this statement to constitute the piece. What I really like about this piece, which is what I guess some of my work's trying to do, is that for me, this piece creates a drawing in my head. It creates this, I imagine this guy going through this act, walking through Central Park, and you see him walking along in a strange direction, not following any path or anything. And suddenly there's a sound and he stops and turns and takes a photo and moves in that direction. And I imagine this kind of zigzag drawing in space. So there are all these just random shots. So I was invited to do a public piece in Sydney, and actually there was a sculptural piece that was up for 9 months, an installation, and then we also did this event, and it's called the Mass Wind Walk, and so I had 50 of these IKEA style slot together that I just took out in a large case, helmet vanes, quite different, and of course they had to conform to lots of health and safety kind of issues, being able to crumple and not poke anybody's eye out. So we had 50 people all set off from Taylor Square in Sydney wearing these, and each person had a smartphone out, so that as they walked, the smartphone was recording their path. And so they slowly start to disperse through the city in this kind of very Brownian motion-like manner. It was quite a still day, so there was quite a lot of kind of milling around at certain junctions and crashing into people. And it was something where it was a public event, and the people who participated were not performers. I didn't see them as performers, they were just people who were invited to come and do it. So this guy, for instance, was actually a yachtsman. There was someone else who worked in wind tunnels, an artist. It had been advertised, and it was just people who kind of thought it would be of interest for them. And we had a whole range of people. And I guess, you might see it as kind of a metaphor for sort of contemporary life and people moving through contemporary life, kind of not in control of where they're going, just being blown randomly through life. But for me it was actually I think a really playful kind of event, spectacle, and a different way of getting people to explore the city and start to understand the way that the city shapes the wind moving through it. A few minutes left for the last piece. This was, as part of the walk-on exhibition, they were doing an event of sort of artists leading walks. And they invited me to lead one of these walks. And I didn't really want to lead people round on a walk, not really my thing. So I went to visit where this was all going to take place up in Northumberland, in the middle of nowhere, in the countryside. And it came over when I was driving to the site. Came over the Pennine Way and this amazing sort of watershed into this huge valley that just sort of stretched out, and it was just a lovely moment coming over the top there. And kind of very quickly came up with the idea of this, this watershed all leading down to the site in the middle. And thought, well, maybe I can devise a piece where we have the landscape sort of directing the walk. So what happened is we set up 20 flags in the landscape. I sewed these little numbered flags up, and each flag had a GPS logger underneath it. And so people set off from their 20 flags, and I waved the big other flag, and they started walking downhill as if there were water running off the land. So not just walking straight down sort of to where's the bottom, there's the bottom of the valley, but literally looking at the ground around them, trying to sort of just tune in and walk, feel the land, and move as if there were water running off it. So they all started to sort of drop into the folds of different valley, sort of folds in the landscape, and then into sort of tighter valleys, and then sort of came, so through quite varied landscapes, and then eventually all meet at the confluence of the two rivers here. So although they started fairly close, those two middle people, they actually ended up dropping into two sort of smaller valleys within this larger watershed and coming down different routes. And so it's a drawing in a way, a drawing of the landscape and a description of water, how water would behave in that landscape. But it's also a drawing that's about an action and about people. And so up there, you've got a funny little bit that's a detours that goes round. And that was a woman who didn't feel very physically able to do that section. So she sort of felt happier sort of missing that bit out and going round. And then you've got people here cutting corners on the sort of the meanders of the river. So yes, that's it. Missed out a few things, but we can hopefully expand in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Tim. What a lot of fun that was, wasn't it? That really was great. Thank you very much indeed. And now, Matt, can you tell us a little bit about your architectural practice and how that relates to the concept of space?
Yes, I'm Mathew Emmett. I'm not going to use the microphone, I'm afraid, but hopefully you can hear me. And I want to talk about my research and my practice as a practicing chartered architect, but also my approach as an artist who composes music and makes films, and how I use that notation system to generate novel architectural practices. So my background is working in London for a company called YRM, and we were focused on airports. And it's quite interesting because when you're designing an airport, you kind of think you're designing efficient space for how to get someone from A to B as quickly as possible, but it's not. It's about how you can get people to spend as much money as possible and generating that itchy wallet scenario of getting through the sock shop, coffee shop, etc. That was interesting. And then worked on hospitals. And I don't know if many of you have been to hospitals, but hospitals seem, from my perspective, to be processing plants designed from the doctor's perspective, but not very much about healing environments and how to deal with trauma. Because all patients are generally well. So I was interested in hospitals. More recently, working on the cancer-focused man on the Royal William Yard and the renovation of that building. And then started working for an architectural theoretician called Charles Jenks, doing these large landscape projects across the world, and working with Studio Leaveskin on the Imperial War Museum in Manchester. And the interesting thing about those two is how they apply a very critical theoretical practice to the making of space. So that was my kind of architectural background. And throughout of all that, I noticed that architects talk about space a lot, but it doesn't have any real tangible meaning. So there's a quote here from Kevin Rowbottom about space in architecture has no palpable generic meaning in itself. And I thought that's quite interesting. I wanted to challenge and question that. It's quite difficult. So, my research looks at the way in which the brain structure and architecture content come together to create consciousness, to create a sense of reality. So I'm looking at the human mind, and I'm talking about the human mind as an ecology of interactions. I'm looking at the performative dimension of how we perform in space and interact, looking at affordances, feedbacks, etc. And through all of this kind of work, I'm trying to generate for me a new language or a tool set to better articulate these experiences with higher granularity, to be able to kind of specify in detail the way that architects design space. So if we just look at architectural space, we're talking about history, place, program, location, zone, spans, and domains. That's the kind of general language which architects use when they're designing or analysing physical environments. But I'm also interested, as I said, about how neurological generated space, the internal environment, talk about atmosphere, presence, frisson, stimulus, abstraction, and the experience of going through these physical environments. And my hypothesis was that when you put these two together, you can generate what I call psychoactive spaces, spaces that influence your mood, your perception, your cognition, your experience. And therefore, architects like to design tool sets because we have to analyse, record, and infer new knowledge through these processes. So these are some examples of mapping tools and generating new typologies that I could profile and understand to generate a framework of meaning. And then at the bottom here is time, but it's a form of perception notation. So just like a musician or a dancer would choreograph their movement through notation, I was generating a language of perception notation. And then heavily influenced by a composer called Karl Stockhausen, who I worked with in Germany for a bit, looking at a form schema that allowed you to program parametrically the kind of performance of walking through a space. So then I started to generate these kind of systems of master plans for generating event performances that I was going to test out. So including operating layers as a kind of assembly language. Technologies, I teamed up with a group called Perception Lab, based in Detmold, and they were experts in eye tracking and biofeedback technology. And I started to utilise their knowledge, but kind of subvert it and try and use it as a way that it wasn't actually designed to use. But then using Max NSP with some custom software to try and organise and structure these events. So I had all this kind of theory, I had the technology, I had the language, I had the framework. I wanted some host sites that I could go and test this stuff out on, and I'm forever looking for interesting sites to work with. So the first one, I got an artist residency at Bath, looking at these underground hidden vaults which aren't open to the public, so it's interesting to work there. ARP bunkers. Plymouth has got hundreds and hundreds of bunkers underneath the city. They're fascinating structures hidden there, latent with all this kind of memory of war. And then kind of in Sweden, these derelict homes, bunkers, air raid shelters, derelict hospitals in Germany, and even a wonderful painting by Matthias Grünwald, which was painted for the Eisenheim altarpiece, and how that was a site of trauma and healing. Having found these sites, I then sort of start imagining my interpretation of those sites and applying these theories and generating these drawings and sketches to kind of visualize and test out and prototype the practice. And these are purely for me to understand how I'm going to approach and generating a dialogue with the project. And then these are some examples of what I actually did within the site. So this is an interactive installation of Roman Baths, and I use audio-visual cues with a spatial sensor that you get on gaming machines that can sense your presence in the space. And you start to interact with the light, and the technology senses where you are, and it starts to change your understanding of that space and how you interact. And then I designed these trigger events, which were specifically designed to alter and shift very quickly your understanding of perception. And then I was using the biosensor technology to record the drawings, but using that kind of technology to draw and record these events. This was a project I did in Switzerland, which was all about estrangement and in Swiss, in Lucerne, with the wonderful lakes, the mountains, yet our host site didn't have views onto those areas, so we were playing around with views of cone views and trying to regenerate these visual links. And so these are distorted views through imaginary visual alignments to the mountains. This is the film. Can I just press go? It's very quick. This was a derelict, abandoned hospital in Germany, and it was 3 rooms, and 3 rooms were linked by this vandalised hole. So what we did was string 360 cables, nylon, between the rooms, and we drew the act of violence in the space and made it manifest. So you end up with this incredibly turning the violent trauma into something very beautiful. And because we were sewing the spaces, that had a kind of memory to what happened in these spaces as well. And that's the end of my talk. So it's a very quick kind of introduction to the kind of thinking, and then some examples of how I apply that through a kind of installation process. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Matt. Fascinating to hear about your practice. Now's the time in the evening when we have the audience can make comments, ask questions about anything that they would like to address to our 3 speakers here. So, if Matt, you'd like to come here, and who's got the first question or comment? I've got to use my glasses because I've realised that I actually... Ah, excellent. Yes, gentleman at the front.
So what's the contrast?
All right, thank you.
If I was to, boom. If I was to contrast the approach of an artist who's describing landscapes derived from responses to wind patterns within an urban environment versus an architect who wants to include the participants in the architecture, the humans that are embroiled in that landscape, I would imagine that the approach of reacting to environmental stimuli is going to lead to a massive swarm of subjectivities, whereas a functional architecture, at its heart, has to deliver something that is functional. It's a structure which serves general human needs. And I'm wondering, how can you resolve these? Is that a polarity? Is there a polarity between individual subjectivities and, on the other hand, generalised structures that everyone needs to live in? And I'm responding also to your statement about the reluctance to instantiate top-down structures as well, and how maybe that reflects back on this. There's a tension there, isn't there, between top-down structures and things that are just rubble because they reflect on a sort of myriad viewpoints. I'd like to hear
So
from
if we start with Tim and then go to Sana.
Okay. I'm not sure I know exactly what the answer would be. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that in the works I showed you there, it's very much about exploring space, and I was kind of showing the action. But as an artist also, when I present these projects more as an installation kind of form, very often in the gallery, then I guess I'm switching slightly to the secondary view of creating a space that the viewer goes into. So, in the one hand, the work in a way is exploring space beyond, and then that comes into the gallery, and I'm creating a space in there where I'm trying to transport somebody mentally to that event that took place.
I think it's an interesting one because quite a lot of architects have changed their views about the top-down, bottom-up sort of approaches to architecture. In the past, they used to be the god, the makers, they know best. And recently, and it's sort of in the last 10 or so years, participatory architecture through consultation, talking to neighbourhoods, understanding their needs, and then building up from there. So obviously there is the sort of structural stuff that the architect comes and sort of helps out with. But quite a lot of the buildings, quite a lot of the projects that are quite successful at the moment, they come from the environment itself. It is a very difficult sort of balance. And I'm not saying it's only bottom up and no top down. I think it's a mix between the two. But it's definitely something which is very much changing in the nature of the work as well in practice in architecture.
Yeah, it's a good question. But as an architect, you have to think about the client, the site, the cost, the budget, QS, structural engineering, and the programme. And I think what all architects try to do is get a greater understanding of how to bring all of those elements together to create a wonderful, beautiful space. And for instance, if you're designing a religious space, how your function, your program would be to create awe and wonder in this other dimension, just as much as you are go back to the airports or the hospitals, where you're designing something that's trying to heal or to control and influence people's efficient movement through space. And I think that's why architecture, city planning is so exciting, because you're looking at behaviours, you're looking at fire regulations, how to get people from A to B efficiently, but also you are dealing with humans who have souls and experiences and all that sort of stuff. I think certain architects and artists focus on other things, obviously, they have a particular interest, but most architects will try and create a really interesting discussion and dialogue through the clients, through the users, and even the contractors as well. Some really good buildings have come out of discussion from really good craftsmen. So I hope, yeah, that's what I'd say.
Good, thank you very much. And we have a question over here.
First, have you noticed where you had on the table? Have you recognised where it's from? Yeah, it's a map of London. So walking was often used as a fuel for thought. So, was it Plato or Socrates? I don't know. Well, one or the other. So have you ever explored the thought process or the emotions that are involved in these walks, or how you kind of get into environment and how people react to environment? Or
so who should we have first for this? Let's not have Tim first. We'll give him last, right? So, all right.
Well, specifically, I was designing a form of notation that recorded your perceptual pickup from walking through these thought-provoking sites, like the military sites or sites of trauma. So the mapping and the notation was a lens to frame and to focus on the body and your sensory pickup of those experiences, and to try and chart them out and visualize them. And since you start visualizing, like Tim's drawings, visualizing those wonderful meandering walks, you start to understand and you can make connections and interpretations which reveal interesting things. So I think that's a linking theme with all three of our work.
I think it's also picking up on what you just started, saying. It's
Is that working?
it's the idea of being able to use then the mapping that comes from these walks or meanders, or the idea of the derive as well. It's what do you do with them afterwards? And I think this is the stuff that is probably most interesting to me. It's how do you then accumulate series of mappings of something and then come up with a solution? And it's not a mapping of one exercise, and I think this is why probably Tim's walks always come in sort of numbers, 7 times walking from the same place. And it's an interesting one, because then you get exposure to certain views, you get exposure to certain feelings, and how do you then layer all those things when you're designing? It's a difficult one to crack, and I suppose not only new technological tools, but also the idea of incorporating it with visual sort of elements with it gets us a bit closer to understanding how we can design for those spaces.
Okay, Tim?
Yeah, I guess, I feel, for me, the walks are an act of exploration, and through doing that as you go through have all these different experiences, and also then when I'm doing these walks with other people, in the work I don't try and record those experiences myself, I wouldn't say, but there was a woman who did the water walk piece who said that she'd been walking for about 40 minutes and she was getting into this incredibly sort of meditative state, just really tuning in with the landscape and really enjoying it. And then she hadn't actually seen anybody else at all. And she was suddenly starting to worry that she was kind of dropped into another valley and was going to sort of end up walking until she reached the sea and kind of was completely by herself. And I don't know, all of that for me was a really nice story, and all sorts of other ones like that, of the experiences that people have on them. But I haven't tried to record or present those experiences. It's probably quite a lot of it, I think, in my work's about kind of almost data, if you like, and collecting data and information and then presenting that. But maybe that's done in a playful way, in a way that makes it quite human in a lot of the work, without directly talking about that.
Any more questions? Yes, we've got one at the back there.
Hi. I'm going to ask actually a really naive question, because I'm a psychologist rather than an architect. And it struck me that the walks kind of really mapped out the space between buildings. And I was thinking, just relating it to personal experience, that when one visits a city as a visitor, as a tourist, you do tend to do that kind of meandering, walking around in the open spaces and between buildings. But when you work, given that I work here in this university, when you work and live somewhere, you actually psychologically occupy the space within the buildings often much more. And it just, I suppose, because of, it was fascinating thinking about how you discovered space through using different ways of guiding you through external space. And I just wondered, in terms of how you think about structure and design, how do you balance that tension about the experience of the space between buildings and the kind of experience of the space within buildings? And does that matter?
Sana, if you'd like to start.
Well, I think
I'm going to pass it on to Matt. The reason is, the quickest sort of answer really is, what are you interested in? It's like psychology. You don't do everything in psychology. And you know, it's exactly the same thing in architecture. It's a wide field, and studying the the understanding of in-between building and urban spaces is a very big field on its own. And then actually understanding how buildings function internally is another field on its own. So I think it's a little bit more of how do you get the sort of both talking, and it's definitely an interest of a practicing architect, which I am not.
I'm passing on.
I mean, I guess you could kind of see, you could see the buildings as sculptures existing within a space, the gallery, but they're also a sculpture that you can kind of inhabit. And I mean, obviously my practice is very different to both of yours, and I don't well, I'm about to actually design some small shelters for a project up in Scotland, which I think will be very interesting, and having to, already looking at that, I'm only very early days, but thinking about the spaces and about what they're going to do for people and all those sort of spiritual or other, as well as practical sort of things that those spaces provide. I think it's really interesting, and I think it's a very complex thing that's, as an artist, very different. We can be very free generally and don't have to deal with fire exits and all of these kind of restrictions that I think can sometimes make it very interesting, and sometimes I'm sure be very difficult.
There's a lot of different professions as well. I mean, with city planning, there's some really good companies that look at this notion of the legible city. So how you navigate through public realm and how you understand where you are and orientate yourself within that public realm. And I think in the UK we're slightly slow at doing this. You go to Germany or France, they're better at it. But there's some really interesting mapping companies, Space Intact, City ID, who are highly specialised at recording, understanding, kind of stripping stuff away so you can really get the presence and the nature of that city as an entity. And again, I think architects and artists do the same, whether it's in a gallery space, whether it's a theatre event, or whether it's a functioning programme. It's a attitude of scales, but you always have this understanding of people going through scenarios. So film set design, because you're making narratives for scenarios to go through. And I think some of my work was trying to challenge the staticness of doing architectural plans, sections, elevations, by looking at the performative dimension of, experiencing things as you travel through space. And I think parametric design and more contemporary architectural modelling looks at that time-based, fourth dimension-based stuff.
I think there's all these different almost drawings, if you like, within it. I mean, I know, so there's the mapping people's paths, there's all the wind studies that are done on spaces. They build models of public realm spaces and they send wind through it, to try and work out how, whether you're sort of creating this huge wind tunnel that no one's going to be able to walk down. These kind of things. And then there's all the services and arteries that run through it. So there's all these different paths and routes of travel for people, services, traffic, wind, all of these things going on. And drainage.
The size of a dust car or an ambulance always needs to be accommodated when you have public realms. So if there's an accident or intervisibility, you should never feel like you could be murdered in an area. That's why Plymouth's covered up all the underground areas. So this notion of intervisibility, you can see your exits, is very important. So you start to acquire and develop all this more sensitive understanding of spatial planning.
We've got time for one more question if we have anyone else. Yes? Gentlemen, yes.
conversation that was just happening there about data and also about the static nature of architecture is making me reflect on what maybe the future of architecture could be like, because your work in particular as an artist is based on real-time recording of people's positions, and in many ways architecture is like a time-lapsed conversation. So an architect would reach out to a clientele, evaluate what their needs are, and that's a conversation that happens in real time, but then the actual implementation of that conversation doesn't happen in real time. It takes maybe years. I mean, obviously in the medieval period that would be lifetimes to get a decent cathedral on the go, but happily we're a bit quicker now. But that conversation is still locked in time, isn't it? And I'm wondering, how is architecture going to respond to the greater flows of information that are now possible through real-time recording on mobile phones and information technologies?
So I'll ask all three speakers to ask on how architecture is going to respond, I suppose, really to the modern world. And we'll start with Sana on that.
I suppose quite a lot of it is answered through installation pieces of work, and this is why it catches up quicker than actual buildings and architecture, sort of fully fledged architecture. So this is where you see lots of testing. This is where you see quite a lot of ideas being implemented just to test those, really upcoming sort of ideas. And then things take shape from there, and you can see them happening. Yes, it's always behind because of all of the regulations and because of, you've got building regs and you've got what's not. There are quite few other things that are, money and the rest of it. And then there is the type of, even councils are involved in, making decisions on whether to do this or not. And you can see quite a lot of it happening in the Far East, or even not slightly closer, Middle East, where you see the boom of, all kinds of sorts of buildings and that pop up in the environment. Much quicker than you see them in a much more established sort of Western context. So yes, there is time sort of associated with it, and I suppose this is why quite a lot of architects like to go on the route of the experimental sort of installation pieces.
I would also think that it's to do with the changing world that we live in and the environmental situation where architecture needs to go. It kind of probably does need to be more light-footed, more flexible in its approach. I'm not being diplomatic, I can't remember who the architect was, did one of the pavilions for the Serpentine, and it was a huge structure with massive, I cycle past it every day, and so I could see these concrete footings going in, these steel columns that were then clad in timber to make them look better, and all this glass roof, and it was a vast sort of heavyweight structure that was a temporary kind of pavilion there, and I was quite angered by having to cycle past this every day because it seemed just inefficient. And so I would say, I would hope that things will become much more efficient and lighter weight and therefore more sustainable and perhaps more adaptable.
The future.
Well, the notion of flexible space and adaptable spaces was picked up in the modernist period, sort of going back to Newton and Roland, 30s, 40s, 50s. So I think that's very true, and I think architects, designers are looking at more performance-based, adaptable, reflexive architecture that can respond to different scenarios. So you're building in greater range of possibilities to the infrastructure. The other thing is that with big projects, they have a legacy kind of understanding, and also they have this kind of predictive modelling. So they try as best as they can future predict how these spaces will be performing and adapting to different needs and things. Again, it's smart if a building can be multifunctional, adaptable, etc., etc. We want to try and build huge foundations and then rip it all out. So that's why we try to avoid style, because style is so flexible and changes all the time. We try and have something which is a bit deeper and a bit more responsive and a bit more cleverly worked out, as we say.
Well, that's been a fascinating evening. I've certainly learnt a lot. Thank you very much to Sana, to Tim and to Nat. And thank you for the audience for your questions. Thank you and good night.